Remember those easy summer dinners your grandparents used to whip up without breaking a sweat? The ones that needed nothing more than leftover meat, a can of soup, and maybe a scoop of mayo, served cold if it was too hot to turn on the stove. These dishes filled bellies, cooled tempers, and somehow tasted like childhood. So why did we stop making them? Spam slab skewers with pineapple
My Hawaiian-style chicken skewers are perfect for your next barbecue or weeknight dinner.
were once the crown jewel of the quick and cheerful backyard grill. Sweet, salty, and unapologetically kitschy, they were a budget-friendly crowd pleaser that brought a taste of the tropics to even the most landlocked summer cookout. During the 1950s and 60s, when America fell in love with all things Hawaiian and canned meats were still riding high, this dish hit the perfect note: easy, flavorful, and a little bit fun. Thick slices of spam were cut into slabs or cubes, skewered alternately with chunks of canned pineapple, bell peppers, and maybe a cherry tomato or two, then brushed with a glaze, usually brown sugar, soy sauce, or a hint of mustard. The sugary pineapple caramelized as it hit the grill, while the spam crisped at the edges, transforming its soft texture into something smoky and snackable. The flavors melded in that classic mid-century sweet and savory way, turning a few pantry staples into a dinner that tasted far more festive than its price tag would suggest. These skewers were fast to assemble and even faster to disappear. They didn't require marinating or any fancy prep, and they fed a crowd with very little effort. Whether served with rice, potato salad, or just eaten off the stick straight from the grill, they delivered the kind of flavor that made guests ask for seconds and kids come back with sticky fingers. More than just a quirky grilling idea, spam slab skewers represented a moment in American cooking when convenience met creativity. Canned meats were no longer just survival food, they were party food. And with the rising popularity of backyard entertaining, anything that could be thrown on the grill and look colorful on a platter was instantly welcome. Today, spam still lingers on store shelves, waiting patiently to be rediscovered. And maybe it's time, because whether you're nostalgic for the past or just tired of overthinking dinner, there's something refreshing about a meal that doesn't try too hard and still tastes great on a paper plate in the backyard. Leftover potato sandwiches were born from pure practicality, a frugal solution to a common kitchen dilemma. After a Sunday roast or weeknight mash, families across generations were left with a bowl of potatoes, too good to toss, but not quite enough for another full meal. The answer? Slap it between bread. It sounds simple, and it was, but don't let that fool you. This humble sandwich turned scraps into something warm, filling, and surprisingly satisfying, especially on a hot summer evening when the stove was off limits and creativity had to pull its weight. These sandwiches varied wildly depending on what was on hand, which is exactly the point. Cold mashed potatoes were the most common base, but leftover roasted potatoes, smashed boiled spuds, or even hash browns found their way between slices of white bread or leftover biscuits. Some versions were served cold with a swipe of butter or mayonnaise, a sprinkle of salt and pepper, and maybe a slice of tomato or onion for brightness. Others were pan-fried in bacon grease until crisp on the outside, then stacked warm and golden onto toast. Add a slice of American cheese or leftover gravy if you were lucky, and you had yourself a meal. This wasn't a dish anyone bragged about. It didn't make it into glossy cookbooks or Sunday supper menus, but it lived quietly in lunch pails, farm kitchens, and corner diners. It was the food of factory breaks and front porch lunches. It was quick, carby, and most importantly, waste-free. In households where nothing went to waste, these sandwiches stood as a quiet act of ingenuity. They stretched $1 and filled a belly, which was more than enough. Today, they may seem like a strange relic of the past, but the logic still holds. Have leftovers, will sandwich. In a world that throws away too much food and overthinks too many meals, there's something refreshingly honest about mashing cold potatoes on toast and calling it dinner. It might not be glamorous, but it's deeply human, resourceful, a little quirky, and rooted in the kind of kitchen wisdom that never really goes out of style. Icebox ham loaf was the cold comfort of many a mid-century summer supper. Served in tidy slices straight from the fridge, it was a dinner table standby when the thought of standing over a hot stove felt downright rebellious. Popular from the 1940s through the 1960s, 1960s, this chilled loaf wasn't just a clever way to reuse leftovers. It was a badge of domestic efficiency, a product of post-war resourcefulness, and a quiet flex of the American housewife's ability to make something out of almost nothing. At its core, the icebox ham loaf was made from finely chopped ham, often leftovers, sometimes canned, combined with minced celery, onion, and sometimes chopped hard-boiled egg for texture. A mixture of unflavored gelatin dissolved in a bit of broth or water gave it structure, binding the loaf into firm, sliceable form. Mayonnaise or evaporated milk helped smooth it all out, while a bit of sweet pickle relish or dry mustard brought just enough zing to keep things interesting. Packed tightly into a loaf pan, it was chilled until set, usually overnight, then inverted onto a plate, garnished with parsley, and served with a side of crackers or a heap of iceberg lettuce. It wasn't fancy, and it certainly wasn't hot, but that was exactly the point. At a time when electricity wasn't cheap and air conditioning wasn't standard, meals like this kept the kitchen and the cook cool. It fed a crowd on a dime, lasted for days, and paired well with potato salad or sliced tomatoes from the backyard garden. Families ate it after church, packed it for picnics, and laid it out proudly at ladies' luncheons next to the lime jello mold. Today, the icebox ham loaf might seem quaint, maybe even a little mysterious, but its spirit, making do, wasting nothing, and staying cool in more ways than one is timeless. And who knows? With a few modern twists, this forgotten summer loaf might just earn itself a second act. Tuna stuffed tomatoes. Before avocado toast and kale smoothies took over the light lunch category, summer tables in mid-century America were graced with a cooler, humbler hero, tuna stuffed tomatoes. Served chilled and often nestled on a bed of lettuce or cottage cheese, these bright red bowls of protein-packed thrift were a staple of 1950s lunches, ladies' luncheons, and picnic baskets. They were the very definition of seasonal resourcefulness, refreshing, affordable, and assembled without turning on the stove. At its heart, the dish was exactly what it sounded like: ripe tomatoes, hollowed out and filled to the brim with a savory mixture of canned tuna, diced celery, chopped hard-boiled egg, mayonnaise, and sometimes a touch of sweet pickle relish or mustard. Some versions called for breadcrumbs or crushed saltines to give the filling body, while others leaned toward the creamy side, even incorporating a bit of evaporated milk. The whole affair was chilled until the tomato took on that firm, cool texture that only a good overnight in the icebox can deliver. For many households, this dish was more than just a way to stretch a can of tuna. It was a little celebration of the backyard garden harvest, a moment of elegance on an otherwise ordinary Wednesday. The tomato acted not only as a container, but as a symbol of summer itself, juicy, ripe, and fleeting. Paired with a glass of iced tea and a slice of watermelon, tuna stuffed tomatoes offered a light yet satisfying meal that felt special without being fussy. Today, it might feel retro or even ironic to serve tuna in a tomato shell, but during its heyday, it was seen as both modern and smart, part of a wave of sensible eating that prized nutrition, presentation, and economy. And frankly, it still works, especially when the garden is bursting and the kitchen is too hot to breathe in. This forgotten summer dinner might be due for a quiet comeback, because sometimes the best meals are the ones that require nothing more than a spoon, a tomato, and a little ingenuity. Cold macaroni ring mold with egg slices. In the golden age of molded foods, few summer dishes were as visually striking or as delightfully peculiar as the cold macaroni ring mold with egg slices. This wasn't just pasta salad. This was pasta salad elevated, set into a decorative ring with the help of unflavored gelatin and a sense of post-war optimism. It was the kind of dish that proudly took center stage at ladies' luncheons and 4th of July potlucks, shimmering on a bed of lettuce like a crown from the pages of a mid-century cookbook. The foundation was humble. Elbow macaroni cooked just to tender, then cooled and folded into a mixture of chopped celery, diced pimentos, and sometimes tiny cubes of cheese or ham. Mayonnaise was the standard binder, though some recipes called for a blend of mayo and condensed soup to give it a creamier, glossier finish. Into this, dissolved gelatin was added, transforming the familiar into the firm. Before chilling, hard-boiled egg slices were pressed pressed into the bottom of the ring mold so they'd appear in perfect formation when the dish was unmolded, a detail that balanced whimsy and precision with uncanny vintage flair. Served cold, often with extra mayonnaise or mustard sauce in the center, the ring mold had a strangely satisfying bite, chewy, creamy, cool. In an era without air conditioning, that mattered, and visually, it delivered a kind of pageantry that plain pasta salad never could. It said, "This is more than leftovers, this is planned, this is prepared." For many, the cold macaroni ring mold with egg slices evokes memories of church basements, community cookbooks, and a time when food presentation was as important as taste. Sure, it might raise a few eyebrows today, especially among those unaccustomed to savory gelatin, but beneath the oddity lies a solid idea. Keep the kitchen cool, stretch ingredients smartly, and serve something that looks like you put in more effort than you actually did. In today's world of ironic retro cookery and TikTok food hacks, this ring mold might just be weird enough and practical enough for a well-deserved comeback. Cottage cheese and canned peach plate. There was a time when the cottage cheese and canned peach plate wasn't just a quirky side, it was lunch. Simple, cool, and oddly elegant in its symmetry. This dish was a staple of post-war kitchen tables, hospital trays, and mid-century diet culture. It's hard to imagine today, but this creamy and sweet combo once carried a certain dignity. You'd find it on diner menus, printed in ladies' magazines, and served at summer luncheons with a sprig of parsley and maybe a maraschino cherry if someone was feeling fancy. The basic idea was blissfully unfussy. A scoop of cottage cheese, plain or lightly salted, nestled into the curve of a halved canned peach, served on a bed of iceberg lettuce. It was chilled, of course, and plated with the kind of care usually reserved for desserts. For extra flair, the peach might be dusted with paprika, the cottage cheese spooned into a gelatin ring, or the whole thing topped with a dollop of mayonnaise, which today feels unthinkable but back then was considered sophisticated. This dish rose to popularity during a time when nutrition advice centered around moderation, and refrigeration was finally a household standard. Cottage cheese was high in protein, low in fat, and endlessly adaptable. Canned peaches, preserved in syrup or juice, added just enough sweetness to make it feel indulgent. Together, they formed a balanced, budget-friendly meal that didn't require heat or fuss, perfect for hot afternoons or quick suppers when no one wanted to cook. For many, this plate brings back memories of mothers watching their waistlines, school cafeteria trays, or grandparents who swore by the virtues of clean, cool eating. It might seem dated now, retro in the most unironic sense, but the principle still holds up. Nourishing food that's ready in minutes and doesn't require turning on the stove. In a world dominated by over-engineered smoothies and protein bars, the cottage cheese and canned peach plate reminds us that sometimes the old ways of eating light were actually kind of brilliant, and maybe, just maybe, it's time to bring this strange little pairing back to the table. Salmon aspic. There was once a time, strange and jiggly though it may seem now, when nothing said elegant summer dinner quite like a salmon aspic. Today, we might recoil at the thought of fish suspended in gelatin, but in the mid-20th century, this was high culinary fashion. It sat proudly on buffet tables at weddings and garden parties, shaped into intricate molds and garnished within an inch of its life. Cold, savory, and unmistakably pink, salmon aspic was as much about presentation as it was about flavor, and in its heyday, it was a serious statement. The dish started with canned salmon, a pantry staple prized for its affordability and long shelf life. The fish was flaked and mixed with a few finely chopped vegetables, celery, cucumber, maybe a bit of grated onion, and folded into a smooth blend of mayonnaise, lemon juice, and sometimes tomato juice for added color. Unflavored gelatin, bloomed in a bit of broth or water, was the magic ingredient that transformed the creamy fish mixture into a firm, sliceable mold. Often poured into a ring or fish-shaped mold, the aspic was chilled for hours, sometimes overnight, until it held together like a pale pink sculpture. Once unmolded, it was usually garnished with fresh dill, hard-boiled egg slices, olives, or cucumber rounds, turning what was essentially cold fish jelly into something fit for company. To modern eyes and modern palates, it may look bizarre, but salmon aspic had a purpose. It was refreshing, elegant, and ideal for hot days when Traditional baked or fried fish dishes were out of the question. For many mid-century cooks, it was also a show of skill. This wasn't a slapdash casserole, it was chilled, molded, unmolded, and artfully arranged. It required planning and a sense of occasion. Today, it survives mostly as a curiosity in vintage cookbooks and retro recipe blogs, but its story tells us something important about ingenuity, presentation, and the constant push-pull between convenience and style. Love it or fear it. Salmon aspic was once the crown jewel of cold summer dinners, and maybe it deserves more respect than it gets. Zucchini boats with breadcrumb topping. Before zucchini noodles and spiralizers became the darlings of diet culture, there were zucchini boats, hollowed-out squash vessels stuffed with whatever needed using up and crowned with a golden breadcrumb topping. This was a dinner born out of midsummer abundance and pure frugal genius. When gardens overflowed with zucchini and neighbors started leaving them anonymously on porches, this recipe turned excess into dinner without a fuss. It was thrifty, light, and most importantly, oven optional if you were clever with a skillet and lid. The base of the dish was, of course, the zucchini itself, usually the big ones that had grown a little too large and were more suited to stuffing than sautéing. Cut lengthwise and scooped clean, they became tidy little canoes ready to carry a filling of chopped vegetables, rice, cheese, breadcrumbs, ground beef, or whatever leftovers were on hand. The beauty was in the flexibility. A bit of onion, garlic, maybe some diced tomato or corn kernels, and a sprinkle of herbs turned it into something fresh and flavorful. But the star, arguably, was the topping. Breadcrumbs tossed with butter or oil, maybe some parmesan if you had it, baked or pan-steamed to a crisp. Zucchini boats weren't just a clever way to use up surplus produce. They were a humble triumph of home gardening and budget cooking. They made vegetables the main event at a time when meat didn't always make it to the plate, especially in rural kitchens or during leaner years. They were light enough to serve on hot evenings, hearty enough to satisfy, and endlessly adaptable to whatever was left in the fridge. For many who grew up in the 60s or 70s, this was a dish that signaled summer in full swing. It came with the smell of tomato vines, the hum of cicadas, and the quiet pride of making something wholesome out of what was already in your backyard. Today, when zucchini shows up pre-spiraled in the grocery store, it's easy to forget the charm and the practicality of these stuffed little boats, but the recipe still holds water, and maybe it's time to set sail again. Green bean and potato hash with bacon drippings. There was a time when dinner didn't need a label like gluten-free or farm to table to be wholesome. It just needed a hot skillet, a few garden vegetables, and maybe a spoonful of leftover bacon drippings. Green bean and potato hash with bacon drippings was one of those throw-together dishes that didn't ask for much but always delivered. It was the essence of resourceful summer cooking, where fresh produce met pantry staples and flavor was coaxed from every scrap. The heart of the dish was simple: boiled or pan-fried potatoes, still tender and golden, combined with green beans that had been blanched or left over from the night before. The two came together in a skillet, slicked with bacon fat, because nothing went to waste, and were seasoned with salt, pepper, and maybe a pinch of sugar or vinegar depending on the household. Some versions added onions for sweetness, or a few crumbles of the bacon itself if there were any left. But the real secret was patience, letting the potatoes crisp on one side, the green beans char just slightly, and everything get kissed with that savory, smoky richness left behind by breakfast's bacon. This was weekday food, quietly filling, unfussy, and made with what was on hand. It often appeared as a meatless main, though sometimes it was stretched with a fried egg on top, or served alongside a slice of ham. In leaner times, it was the whole meal, filling bellies without stretching wallets. What made it special wasn't complexity, but care. It was the way the beans softened just enough, the potatoes crisped without crumbling, and how that lingering taste of bacon carried it all. For many families, this was a reminder of grandparents who cooked by feel and flavor, not recipe cards. Today, when we rush past green beans for bagged salads and discard bacon drippings without a second thought, it's worth remembering dishes like this. Green bean and potato hash didn't pretend to be gourmet, but it was good. And when you're tired, hungry, and craving something real, it still is. Succotash stew with salt pork. Long before the phrase plant-based became trendy, home cooks were simmering pots of succotash stew with salt pork, a humble, hearty dish that stretched vegetables into a satisfying meal with little more than seasoning and thyme. Born from Native American and colonial food traditions and popularized through centuries of frugal cooking, succotash was the kind of dish that changed with the seasons and the contents of the root cellar. But when summer came and the gardens were full, it became something special. A fresh stew of sweet corn, lima beans, and whatever else the backyard or pantry could spare, enriched with the deep, savory flavor of salt pork. Salt pork was the original flavor bomb, cheap, preserved, and packed with richness. Just a small slab rendered down in the pot would lay the foundation, infusing the vegetables with a smoky, meaty essence. Into that base went chopped onions, diced potatoes, fresh tomatoes, and a medley of beans, lima, green, or even pintos if that's what you had. The star, of course, was corn. Cut straight from the cob, it added sweetness and body to the stew, thickening it naturally as the starches cooked out. There wasn't one way to make succotash. Every region and household had its own take. Some thickened it with flour, others let it stay brothy. Some added milk or cream near the end for a chowder-like texture. But all versions shared a deep connection to the land, to leftovers, and to making do with what was in reach. It was especially popular in leaner times like the Great Depression and World War II, when meat was scarce but gardens were plentiful. Served hot or lukewarm, often with cornbread or biscuits on the side, succotash stew with salt pork was nourishment in its purest form. It didn't try to impress, it aimed to sustain. And in doing so, it became something greater than the sum of its parts. In today's world of meal kits and flash frozen entrees, there's something powerful about a stew that starts with scraps and ends in comfort. Maybe it's time to let succotash simmer again. Corn fritter casserole was the dish you made when the corn was fresh, the budget was tight, and the family was hungry. It took the humble joy of a fried corn fritter, crispy, golden, and sweet, and stretched it into something that could feed a crowd without demanding much more than a mixing bowl and a casserole dish. While the origins are murky, it found its footing in mid-century kitchens, particularly in rural areas where corn was abundant and meat was used sparingly, if at all. This casserole was part comfort food, part survival strategy. The basic recipe was a batter-like mixture of corn kernels, fresh if you had them, canned or frozen if you didn't, folded into eggs, flour, and milk, often with a pinch of baking powder to give it lift. Some cooks added shredded cheddar, a sprinkle of green onion, or even a touch of sugar to highlight the corn's natural sweetness. It was poured into a greased dish and baked until puffed, golden, and just set in the center. The result was a cross between cornbread and a soft souffle, crusty on the edges, tender inside, and bursting with that distinct summer flavor. What made this casserole so appealing wasn't just its taste, though it was certainly satisfying. It was the fact that it required almost nothing fancy. You didn't need meat, you didn't need anything fresh but corn, and even that was negotiable, and you didn't need to stand over a skillet flipping fritters one by one. This was a fix-it-and-forget-it solution for tired cooks feeding big families. Corn fritter casserole often appeared on the table next to sliced tomatoes, green beans, or cold chicken, but it held its own as a main dish, especially on meatless Mondays or during leaner years. It was adaptable, forgiving, and always welcome. Today, when casseroles are often overlooked for being too old-fashioned or heavy, this one deserves a second glance. It's light, nostalgic, and just about perfect when the corn is sweet and the kitchen is hot. One bite, and you'll understand why generations kept coming back to this golden baked comfort. Chilled beet soup, borscht style. There's something quietly luxurious about a bowl of chilled beet soup on a sweltering summer day. Silky, jewel-toned, and served cold enough to fog a glass bowl, this Eastern European staple, most famously known in its borscht form, crossed into American kitchens through immigrant ingenuity and wartime necessity. During times when fresh produce was abundant but energy and meat were scarce, chilled beet soup was a vibrant, nourishing solution that didn't ask much from the stove. At its heart, This soup is a celebration of the humble beet. Earthy, sweet, and shockingly magenta. Beets were boiled or roasted, then grated or pureed, and mixed with a light broth, often just the cooking water, brightened with vinegar or lemon juice. From there, it was up to the cook's background and what was in the pantry. Some versions added cucumber, scallions, or dill. Others used a dollop of sour cream to swirl in richness and a soft pink hue. Hard-boiled eggs were often sliced on top for a protein boost, and potatoes or cabbage might make an appearance if they were already on hand. Though it came from old-world traditions, chilled beet soup fit right into Depression-era and post-war American cooking. It was meatless yet filling, served cold so the oven stayed off, and made use of garden-grown ingredients in a way that felt refreshingly modern. For many immigrant families, especially those of Polish, Ukrainian, or Russian descent, it was both comfort food and cultural preservation, keeping the flavor of home alive in a new world. Despite its striking appearance, this dish was never meant to be flashy. It was practical, frugal, and deeply tied to season and place. But its elegance, the way it manages to be cooling, hearty, and slightly tangy all at once, has kept it quietly enduring. Today, in an era where cold soups are often misunderstood or passed over entirely, chilled beet soup stands out as a timeless summer classic. It's a reminder that frugal food can still be beautiful, that tradition can be refreshingly cool, and that sometimes the brightest meals come from the darkest roots. Ground beef, kebabs with onion chunks. Before backyard grilling became a competitive sport with digital thermometers and dry rubs from 4 different regions, there were ground beef kebabs with onion chunks, a simple, smoky staple of summer dinners that didn't require much more than skewers, fire, and a pound of budget beef. This was the kind of cookout food that didn't come from a recipe card so much as a grandmother's intuition and a working knowledge of whatever was thawed and ready. Ground beef, the unsung hero of post-war frugality, was seasoned simply: salt, pepper, maybe a dash of Worcestershire or dried herbs if you were feeling adventurous. Some families stretched it further with breadcrumbs or an egg, forming a texture somewhere between a meatball and a burger patty. The meat was then packed around metal or wooden skewers in thick logs or oval patties, interspersed with big, rustic slices of onion. The onions weren't just for show, they added sweetness as they charred, and their moisture kept the beef from drying out. These kebabs sizzled over charcoal grills, campfires, or even stovetop broilers in a pinch. There were no fancy marinades, no overnight prep, just the kind of throw-together dinner that tasted better than it had any right to. Paired with corn on the cob or a cold macaroni salad, they fed families, neighbors, and church potluck crowds all summer long. The appeal wasn't just in the taste, it was in the act of cooking itself. Kids could help skewer, the grill stayed outside where the heat belonged, and cleanup was blessedly minimal. For a few brief months each year, these humble kebabs turned any backyard into a weekend retreat. In a time when beef was cheap but time and appliances were limited, ground beef kebabs with onion chunks offered a satisfying solution. They weren't fancy, but they were reliable. And as food trends loop back around to simple, fire-cooked flavors and nostalgic charm, it might just be time to bring them back, because nothing says summer quite like the smell of sizzling beef and caramelized onions in the air. Grilled bologna steak sandwiches were once the unexpected stars of a backyard cookout, salty, smoky, sizzling proof that a satisfying summer meal didn't need to be expensive or complicated. Before gourmet burgers and marinated tri-tip took over the grill, thick slices of bologna, yes, the humble lunch meat, were thrown over open flames and transformed into something gloriously savory, frizzled at the edges and just bold enough to call itself a steak. This was working-class cooking at its best. Bologna was cheap, easy to find, and had a flavor that practically begged for a char. When sliced thick and slapped onto a hot grill or cast iron skillet, it puffed and curled, searing at the edges and releasing a smoky aroma that turned heads from across the yard. A quick score across the edges kept it from buckling too much, and a glaze of barbecue sauce or a swipe of yellow mustard gave it character. The sandwich came together quickly: a toasted bun or slice of white bread, maybe some grilled onions, a slice of cheese if you were lucky, and that sizzling disc of bologna, steaming in the summer heat. Some families added pickles, others used used coleslaw, and a few purists left it plain, letting the meat speak for itself. No matter how you dressed it, it was satisfying, portable, and proudly unpretentious. In its heyday, particularly in the 1960s and 70s, this sandwich wasn't just a quick meal, it was an experience. It was Dad standing at the grill with a spatula and a cold drink. It was dinner after a Little League game. It was what you made when payday was a week away, but the weather begged you to eat outside. Today, it might sound like a relic of a less health-conscious time, but the charm of grilled bologna steak sandwiches and far more satisfying than its humble ingredients suggest. In a world where food tries so hard to impress, there's something refreshing about a sandwich that only aims to satisfy and does it perfectly. Liver and onion foil.
Liver is one of the most nutritious meats on the planet, and it is absolutely delicious if it's prepared well.
Packets may not top today's summer grilling charts, but once upon a time that they were a regular feature on picnic tables and campground fire rings. They combined thrift, simplicity, and hearty nutrition in a tidy, foil-wrapped bundle. At a time when nothing went to waste and every cut of meat had a purpose, liver wasn't a curiosity. It was a staple. Wrapped in foil with onions and seasonings, it became a frugal but flavorful meal made all the better by the open flame. The liver, usually beef or pork, was sliced thin and laid over a bed of onions, which cooked down into sweetness as the packet steamed on the grill or nestled among campfire coals. Salt, pepper, and sometimes a splash of Worcestershire or vinegar helped cut through the liver's intensity, while the foil held in all the juices. For many families, this was a one-and-done dinner. Meat, aromatics, and flavor, all sealed in and cooked with minimal cleanup. It wasn't just a matter of convenience. Liver was prized for its iron and vitamin content, making it a go-to for growing kids and tired adults alike. Wrapped in foil, it cooked gently, preventing the toughness that gave liver its mixed reputation. The onions mellowed everything out, turning even skeptics into reluctant fans, especially when a hot buttered biscuit or slice of cornbread came alongside. Liver and onion foil packets were especially popular during the mid-century boom of camping culture, when families took to the outdoors with station wagons, thermoses, and aluminum foil by the yard. No mess, no plates needed, just a fork, a patch of shade, and a fire. These days, liver is more often forgotten than embraced, dismissed as old-fashioned or too bold. But wrapped in foil with onions and tossed on a grill, it tells a different story, one of thrift, flavor, and meals made with care. It may not win any beauty contests, but it earns its place on the forgotten summer dinner list for good reason. Maybe all it needs is a little smoke and a second chance. Beer braised hot dog.
I'm going to make for you today some simple, gorgeous beer braised sausages.
Hash might sound like something scraped together at the tail end of a camping trip, and honestly, that's part of its charm. This quirky, thrifty skillet meal was born out of necessity, an answer to the age-old question, what can I make with one pack of hot dogs and whatever's in the fridge? But under its scrappy exterior lies a dish with real summer soul. It's smoky, salty, and just messy enough to feel a little rebellious. And in the days before craft beer pairings and gourmet sausages, it was a weeknight win for households that needed dinner fast and cheap. The recipe was flexible, but the idea stayed the same. Hot dogs, usually cut into thick coins or rough chunks, were browned in a skillet alongside diced onions and sometimes bell peppers or leftover potatoes. The magic happened when a splash of beer was poured in, deglazing the pan and turning all those browned bits into a rich, savory glaze. The alcohol cooked off quickly, leaving behind depth and just a hint of bitterness to balance the saltiness of the dogs. Some cooks added a spoonful of mustard, a sprinkle of paprika, or whatever seasoning lived closest to the stove. Served hot straight from the pan, beer braised hot dog hash was often ladled over toast, piled into buns like sloppy joes, or just scooped onto plates next to a dollop of coleslaw. It was working class comfort food at its finest, cheap, filling, and flavorful with ingredients ingredients already on hand. For families in the 60s, 70s, and even into the early microwave era, this dish was a go-to for quick summer dinners that didn't break the budget. It kept the stove on just long enough to build flavor, but not enough to overheat the house. And when paired with a cold drink and a back porch breeze, it was exactly right. Today, it's easy to overlook a meal made from hot dogs and beer, but this hash proves that great food doesn't have to be fancy. It just has to hit the spot, and this one always did. Peanut butter noodle salad.
On today's menu, a simple and delicious recipe that's rich, earthy, and a little nutty. A crunchy peanuts and chili noodles.
Might sound like a modern fusion invention, something you'd stumble across in a trendy cafe or on a Gen Z lazy meal hack TikTok, but it actually has roots stretching back to frugal kitchens and mid-century creativity. This cold, creamy, protein-packed pasta dish emerged during eras when pantries had to stretch, meat was expensive or rationed, and the goal was always to feed a family without turning on the oven. Think Depression-era thrift meets post-war pantry optimism. The backbone of the dish was simple: cooked spaghetti or egg noodles, cooled and tossed with a savory sweet dressing made from peanut butter, vinegar, a bit of sugar, and a dash of soy sauce or Worcestershire, whatever was available. Some versions used evaporated milk to loosen the sauce. Others leaned into spice with a bit of dry mustard or cayenne. What you ended up with was a dish that hit every satisfying note: creamy, salty, tangy, and just sweet enough to feel like a treat rather than a compromise. It often included vegetables too: shredded carrots, chopped celery, maybe green onions or leftover peas. The vegetables weren't just for nutrition. They added crunch, color, and a sense of abundance. In homes where meat was scarce, the peanut butter provided protein, and the noodles brought that beloved carb comfort that makes a meal feel complete. In the 1970s, this dish saw a brief cultural revival thanks to the increasing popularity of Asian-inspired recipes in mainstream American cookbooks, though often without the authenticity. It was labeled exotic, despite being built on pantry basics, but it never quite reached trend status. It stayed tucked in community cookbooks and family recipe boxes, passed around church basements and school potlucks. Today, peanut butter noodle salad feels surprisingly current. No cook, easily vegan, endlessly customizable, and packed with nostalgic heart. It's a recipe that reminds us you don't need a long ingredient list or a trip to the specialty store to make something deeply comforting. Sometimes all it takes is a half box of pasta, a jar of peanut butter, and a bit of summertime hunger to make something memorable. Cold spaghetti pie with mayo glaze.
What I'm going to do here is use up some veggies that have been sitting in my fridge, and I love to sneak them into my spaghetti pie.
Is one of those dishes that sounds like a dare, but was, in fact, a proud product of mid-century kitchen ingenuity. It's part pasta bake, part gelatin mold, and entirely emblematic of an era that believed any meal could be improved by chilling it into a sliceable wedge. If that sounds absurd to modern ears, well, that's part of the charm. This dish was a summertime solution to leftovers, oven avoidance, and the eternal quest to keep things company ready without breaking a sweat. The base started, naturally, with cold cooked spaghetti, often leftover from the night before. Instead of reheating, it got tossed with eggs, shredded cheese, diced ham or vegetables, and maybe a spoonful of relish or mustard for zip. This mixture was pressed into a pie pan and left to firm up in the fridge. Sometimes it was baked first to set the eggs, but in the true no-heat versions, it was simply chilled until sliceable. Either way, the pie emerged as a savory, sliceable disc, ready to be served cold alongside iceberg lettuce and maybe a vinegar-heavy cucumber salad. But what truly made this dish a relic of its time was the mayo glaze. Yes, glaze. A shiny, creamy topping made of mayonnaise thinned with a bit of lemon juice, milk, or even gelatin, then poured over the top or piped decoratively, sometimes with parsley trapped inside like edible confetti. It was meant to add moisture, flavor, and that ever-important finished look. After all, nothing said 1950s dinner party quite like a mayonnaise sheen. Today, cold spaghetti pie with mayo glaze may feel like an edible punchline, but for those who remember it, it was a clever way to stretch pantry staples, avoid a hot stove, and keep meals visually impressive when flavor wasn't always the top priority. In an era when the fridge was the heart of the kitchen and gelatin molds ruled the dinner table, this quirky pie held its own. It was odd, resourceful, and oddly comforting, just like so many forgotten summer dinners of decades past. Bread salad with bacon fat vinaigrette.
If you have tomatoes and some leftover bread, you have to try this salad. Check this out.
Isn't just a dish, it's a love letter to frugality and flavor. Before sourdough became trendy and panzanella got the Food Network glow up, this was a humble way to turn stale bread into something savory and substantial. It thrived in farmhouse kitchens and cast iron skillets, especially during hot summer months when fresh vegetables were abundant, meat was scarce, and wasting food was unthinkable. The foundation of the salad was day-old bread, crusty, tough, and perfect for soaking up dressing without turning to mush. Cubed and pan-toasted, or simply torn by hand and left to sit out, the bread became the backbone of the dish. Then came the vegetables, sliced tomatoes, slivered onions, maybe cucumbers, or leftover green beans from the night before. But the real star, the reason your cousins suddenly showed up uninvited, was the warm bacon fat vinaigrette. Made by saving every golden drop from a morning fry-up or can of cooked-down salt pork, the bacon grease was whisked with vinegar, usually apple cider or white, a touch of mustard, maybe a pinch of sugar or salt. Poured hot over the bread and vegetables, it transformed a dry heap into something glistening and aromatic, smoky and bright. The warm fat coaxed flavor from every ingredient, slightly wilting the vegetables and crisping the bread's edges just enough. Every bite was a contrast, crunchy and soft, tangy and savory, familiar and oddly luxurious. This wasn't salad for the calorie counters or the lettuce lovers. It was hearty and rustic, meant to be eaten from enamel bowls with sweet tea on the porch, or packed in wax paper for a cool lunch under a shade tree. It didn't rely on expensive ingredients or fancy plating, just what was on hand and a clever bit of transformation. In a time when bacon is sold like gold and salad is often overthought, bread salad with bacon fat vinaigrette reminds us of a different kind of cooking where nothing was wasted, flavor was king, and summer dinners were simple, smart, and deeply satisfying. Macaroni, tomato, veg all casserole, served cold, of course, served cold and unapologetically proud of it, was the crown jewel of mid-century make-ahead summer dinners. The name alone reads like a pantry inventory list, and that's exactly what it was, a clever combination of shelf-stable goods, blended and chilled into a dish that could stretch a grocery budget and feed a crowd without ever breaking a sweat. In the golden age of casseroles and Tupperware parties, this one reigned supreme at potlucks, picnics, and Wednesday night suppers. The base was elbow macaroni, cooked just to the edge of tender and cooled under a faucet with all the urgency of someone trying not to steam up the kitchen. To that, in went a can of veg-all, those soft, salty, mixed vegetables suspended in brine. Every bite a surprise of diced carrot, potato, lima bean, or green bean. Then came the tomatoes, often a can of stewed or diced ones, or sometimes the Tangier punch of tomato soup, stirred in for body and color. A scoop of mayonnaise, or Miracle Whip depending on family loyalties, helped bind it all, giving the mixture that creamy, cozy texture that defined so many mid-century salads and casseroles. The casserole was chilled until firm, sliced or scooped like potato salad, and served cold, yes, on purpose. A dusting of paprika or a few rings of green pepper on top turned it into something that at least looked festive. It was a dish that didn't need the oven, didn't ask for attention, and somehow tasted better the next day. To modernize, it might seem a little beige, but in its day, it was practical magic. It fed hungry families using just a few canned goods, required no fancy equipment, and could sit safely on a picnic table for hours. In an era when hot kitchens were the enemy and leftovers were a badge of honor, macaroni tomato veg-all casserole was a quiet victory. It may not win points for elegance, but it earned its place through resourcefulness, comfort, and the humble brilliance of making something from almost nothing. Sautéed cabbage and noodles, haluski,
Let me show you how to make this delicious cabbage and noodle dish.
Lovingly known as haluski, is the kind of dish that doesn't need flair or flash to win your heart. It's an old-world comfort food with roots in Eastern European immigrant kitchens, where budget meals were born out of necessity but made memorable with butter, onions, and a lot of love. Brought to American tables by Polish, Slovak, and Hungarian families, haluski became a staple in coal towns, steel cities, and eventually anywhere cabbage was cheap and appetites were big. At its core, haluski is the humblest of combinations: egg noodles, green cabbage, butter or bacon drippings, and onion. Some versions add a sprinkle of black pepper or a touch of caraway, but the beauty lies in its simplicity. The cabbage is sautéed low and slow, melting down until sweet and tender. Onions are softened to golden perfection. The noodles, thick and chewy, are cooked just right, then tossed in to soak up all that buttery goodness. This dish wasn't made to impress. It was made to fill you up and keep you going. It stretched ingredients during hard times, and it's no wonder it became a go-to during the Great Depression, wartime rationing, and long summer months when meat was scarce. Cabbage kept well and grew easily, and noodles could be homemade or pulled from a dusty pantry shelf. No oven required, no fuss expected. There's something profoundly nostalgic about the smell of cabbage caramelizing in a pan, or the sound of noodles sizzling as they hit hot fat. For many, haluski brings back memories of grandmothers and house dresses, worn wooden spoons, and kitchen tables crowded with cousins. It's peasant food with staying power, simple, savory, and deeply satisfying. Today, it might not show up on trendy restaurant menus, but haluski still speaks to those who appreciate food that's honest, hearty, and made with care. It's a reminder that a good meal doesn't need to be expensive or complicated. Sometimes all you need is a cabbage, a bag of noodles, and a little time at the stove to feel like everything's going to be all right. Canned chicken curry. Skillet was never meant to compete with the fragrant, slow-simmered curries of India or Thailand. No, this was its own thing, a proud child of the American pantry, born somewhere between wartime convenience and a curious craving for exotic flavor on a Tuesday night. It was the kind of dish that showed up in church cookbooks and 1970s homemaker magazines, promising a one-pan meal that could transform canned goods into something that at least felt worldly. The base was almost always canned chicken, shredded, a little mushy, but undeniably handy, tossed into a hot skillet with some diced onion, maybe a clove of garlic if someone was feeling adventurous. It sizzled alongside a healthy spoonful of curry powder, not the complex spice blends we know today, but that bright yellow tin labeled curry that smelled of turmeric, mustard seed, and mystery. Add a splash of broth from a Cuba, of course, a spoonful of mayo or sour cream, and maybe some raisins or chopped apple if a little sweetness was desired. The result was golden, creamy, a bit tangy, and strangely addictive. Some recipes folded in frozen peas or slivered almonds, while others dumped everything over cooked rice or egg noodles straight from the pot. It was a choose-your-own-adventure kind of meal, as long as the adventure was affordable and dinner could be ready in under 30 minutes. It might not win authenticity awards, but canned chicken curry skillet had heart. It brought spice to tables where salt and pepper usually ruled, and it made families feel like they were eating something different, something with flair. It spoke to a time when curiosity about global cuisine was growing, but the ingredients had to come from the local A&P. Today, it might feel dated or even a little wrong, but for many it was a formative flavor, a stepping stone to broader culinary horizons. And in the right light, it still holds up. It's warm, bold, and just strange enough to feel special again. All from a can, a skillet, and a sprinkle of bold, mid-century optimism. Egg and rice stir-fry with ketchup, depression fried rice, known in some circles as depression fried rice, is one of those dishes that perfectly captures the spirit of making do. It's not glamorous, it's not Instagrammable, but it's honest. A little bit sweet, a little bit savory, and deeply satisfying satisfying in the way that only comfort food born from hard times can be. This wasn't about recreating Chinese takeout at home. It was about stretching a handful of leftover rice and turning it into something warm, filling, and oddly delicious. The core ingredients were simple and always on hand: cold, cooked rice, an egg or two, and a squirt or 3 of ketchup. The rice was usually day-old, clumpy, a little dry, perfect for frying. It hit the hot skillet with a sizzle, followed by scrambled eggs stirred in quickly to create golden flecks throughout. Then came the ketchup. Not too much, just enough to coat the grains in that unmistakable reddish sheen and add a tangy sweet kick. Some folks added chopped onions or frozen peas if they were lucky. A dash of soy sauce might sneak in, or a sprinkle of black pepper. But even in its plainest form, this dish had its charm. This fried rice wasn't trying to fool anyone. It was proudly frugal, a product of the Great Depression, post-war rationing, or a paycheck that had to last just a few days longer. Ketchup acted as both seasoning and sauce, turning bland starch into something kids would actually eat and adults could stomach without complaint. Today, we might call it pantry fusion or a nostalgic twist on comfort food. But for those who grew up with it, it was just dinner. It was the sound of a spatula scraping a skillet and the smell of something hot, familiar, and ready in 5 minutes. Egg and rice stir-fry with ketchup reminds us that good food doesn't have to be fancy. Sometimes it's just about working with what you've got and somehow making it taste like home. Shrimp and grits with canned shrimp might not be the star of any southern brunch buffet today, but once upon a time, it was a clever twist on a coastal classic, made possible even for folks living miles from the ocean. This dish hails from the American South, where grits have long been a staple, cheap, warm, and endlessly adaptable. But fresh shrimp? That was a luxury, especially for inland families or anyone watching their grocery budget. Enter canned shrimp, the shelf-stable hero of pantries from the 1940s through the 70s. The method was simple but comforting. A bubbling pot of grits, slow-cooked with water or milk until creamy and thick. Salt, pepper, maybe a pat of butter stirred in. While the grits did their thing, a skillet got to work on the topping. Canned shrimp, drained and patted dry, sautéed with a little onion and green pepper, or just a bit of garlic powder if that's all that was on hand. Sometimes a splash of Worcestershire sauce or hot sauce gave it depth. Other times a can of cream of mushroom or celery soup was stirred in to stretch it even further and create a silky gravy. This version of shrimp and grits didn't pretend to be fancy. It didn't have bacon lardons or heirloom cheese, but it had heart and hunger behind it. It was a meal that came together quickly, filled the belly, and offered a whisper of seafood even when you were far from the shore. For many families, it was a taste of something special during lean times, or a way to dress up an otherwise plain weeknight supper. These days, shrimp and grits have been reinvented into gourmet fare, but the canned version still deserves a place in the memory banks. It's a humble reminder of the creativity baked into home kitchens when resources were tight and ambition was high. In its own way, shrimp and grits with canned shrimp is a love letter to Southern grit. Resourceful, resilient, and just a little bit salty. Canned tuna and biscuit dough skillet bake was the kind of dish that showed up when the grocery money ran low, but the will to make something hot and hearty remained high. This was no fussy tuna tartare or upscale niçoise. This was the kind of tuna dinner that came bubbling out of a cast iron skillet, smelling like the 1950s and tasting like thrift shop ingenuity. Somewhere between a casserole and a campfire cobbler, it was a comfort meal built from cans, tubes, and a little kitchen stubbornness. The heart of it, of course, was the ever-reliable canned tuna. Chunk light, packed in oil or water, didn't matter, just drained and flaked. Mixed up with a can of cream of mushroom or celery soup, maybe a splash of milk to stretch it, and often a handful of frozen peas or canned corn for color and conscience. This creamy concoction went into a hot skillet where it began to bubble and thicken like a promise. Then came the crown jewel, biscuit dough. Not homemade, no time for that. This was pop-the-can, store-brand biscuit dough, torn or halved and nestled right on top of the tuna mixture. As it baked, the biscuits puffed up golden and slightly crisp on top, soaking in just enough of the sauce below to become tender and savory inside. It was like a pot pie's lazy cousin, less crust, more comfort. This was a weeknight warrior of a meal. It didn't demand much and gave everything it had. It fed kids, filled lunch boxes the next day, and earned a spot on handwritten recipe cards passed passed from neighbor to neighbor. It was a dish born out of the mid-century boom in convenience foods and the ever-present need to stretch a can of meat into a meal. Today, it might be laughed off as retro or even a little grim, but to many, it's a memory of grandma's kitchen or the first meal you made on your own. Canned tuna and biscuit dough. Skillet bake was a triumph of creativity over circumstance, a bubbly, biscuit-topped badge of culinary courage. Meatloaf salad may sound like a punchline today, but once upon a time, it was a summer supper strategy that made surprising sense. It emerged from an era when no food was wasted, especially not a single cold slice of meatloaf sitting in the fridge. In the decades following the Depression and into the frugal kitchens of the 50s and 60s, leftover meatloaf wasn't just reheated, it was reinvented. And when the weather was too hot to justify firing up the oven, slicing that cold meatloaf over a crisp salad became a stroke of genius. The base was usually iceberg lettuce, chopped with the kind of decisiveness only vintage housewives could muster. It might be joined by a few thin rings of red onion, some cucumber rounds, maybe even a hard-boiled egg if the day had gone particularly well. Then came the star, the chilled meatloaf, sliced thick or crumbled into hearty chunks. Its savory, ketchup-glazed edges offered a satisfying contrast to the crunch of the greens below. Dressing? It depended on the household. Some swore by a generous drizzle of Thousand Island or French dressing. The sweeter the better. Others kept it simple with a splash of vinegar and oil or even a dollop of mayonnaise mixed with pickle juice. The goal wasn't culinary perfection. It was balance, economy, and making sure no one left the table hungry. What's striking about meatloaf salad is how forward-thinking it actually was. Today, we praise high-protein, low-carb, deconstructed meals with fancy names. But decades ago, folks were doing the same thing, just with fewer hashtags. It's a meal that honors yesterday's effort while adapting to today's need. Sure, it's not glamorous. It won't appear on a trendy bistro menu anytime soon, but meatloaf salad is a quiet salute to the resourceful cooks who knew how to stretch a dollar, a dish, and a summer evening. And maybe, just maybe, it deserves a second look the next time you've got a lonely leftover slice waiting in the fridge. Fried cornbread panzanella is what happens when Southern thrift meets Italian tradition on a hot summer night. Long before the term fusion cuisine became a culinary buzzword, home cooks were making do with what they had, and this dish is a prime example of that quiet brilliance. Panzanella, a rustic Tuscan salad made with stale bread, tomatoes, and oil, was already a genius way to avoid waste. Swap in leftover cornbread and you've got a dish that's unmistakably American, frugal, flavorful, and deeply satisfying. In the South, cornbread was never allowed to go to waste. Day-old slices that had gone a little dry were perfect for frying. Cubed and tossed in a hot skillet with a bit of bacon grease or butter, the cornbread crisped up on the edges while staying soft at the center, somewhere between a crouton and a hush puppy. Once golden, those little cubes were tossed into a bowl with juicy summer tomatoes, slivers of onion, cucumbers fresh from the garden, and maybe a handful of torn basil if someone was feeling fancy. The dressing was simple but potent. Apple cider vinegar or white vinegar, a glug of oil, salt, pepper, and a pinch of sugar. The whole thing was left to rest just long enough for the flavors to mingle and the cornbread to soak up every bit of that sweet tart dressing without losing its structure. The result? A dish that's simultaneously crisp, tender, tangy, and rich. A true textural miracle. Fried cornbread panzanella was often served at Sunday suppers or as a standalone meal when the stove just didn't need to be on any longer than necessary. It didn't pretend to be elegant, but it had presence. It tasted like garden bounty and cast iron and passed down know-how. Today, it's the kind of dish that would look right at home in a farm-to-table restaurant, dressed up with heirloom tomatoes and local herbs. But its heart still belongs to the grandmother with leftover cornbread on the counter and a summer tomato ripening on the sill. A humble, crunchy, vinegary ode to not letting anything go to waste. Leftover roast beef, creamed on toast, is the kind of no-nonsense dish that once stood proudly at the center of a weekday supper, especially in households that believed wasting food bordered on sin. It was comfort food with a wartime backbone, salvaged from Sunday's roast, stretched with pantry staples, and ladled over toast like a warm, savory balm for the soul. There was no pretense here, no fancy garnish, just flavor, thrift, and a little total white sauce wizardry. The heart of the dish was simple. Yesterday's roast beef, thinly sliced or chopped fine, warmed in a homemade cream sauce. The sauce itself was a quick roux of flour and fat, often butter, though bacon, grease, or drippings were fair game, loosened with milk and stirred until smooth and thick. Sometimes a dash of Worcestershire made it in, or a spoonful of mustard, adding just enough zing to keep things lively. Once the beef was folded in, the mixture simmered until the meat surrendered into the sauce, tender and full of second life flavor. Meanwhile, slices of sandwich bread were toasted. Plain white was the standard, but anything sturdy enough to soak up the gravy without collapsing would do. The creamed beef was spooned generously over each slice, sometimes with a side of peas or mashed potatoes if you were stretching the meal to feed a few more mouths. It wasn't fancy, but it was filling. It stuck to your ribs in the best way. This was a dish born of Depression-era sensibilities and wubby-up-to rationing. When stretching a roast for multiple meals wasn't just smart, it was survival. But it didn't feel like sacrifice. It felt like home, like being taken care of, like someone loved you enough to reinvent a meal instead of tossing it. Today, it may not have the Instagram sparkle or the gourmet label, but leftover roast beef creamed on toast still delivers something we're all quietly craving. A hot plate of familiarity, made with care, served with love, and maybe a little black pepper sprinkled on top. Cabbage roll casserole, made with yesterday's rice and soup, was the lazy genius answer to an old-world dish that usually demanded an afternoon and a grandmother's patience. Traditionally, cabbage rolls meant boiling, stuffing, rolling, layering, and baking. A labor of love, yes, but also a hot, sweaty endeavor. Enter the casserole version. All the flavor of Grandma's Eastern European Sunday supper, none of the fuss, and, conveniently, a way to use up yesterday's leftover rice and the half can of tomato soup lurking in the fridge. This dish was the masterclass in Depression-era efficiency. Ground beef, browned and seasoned, met up with cooked rice, usually whatever was left from last night's dinner. Chopped cabbage was either pre-sautéed to soften it up or simply layered and raw, trusting the oven to do the heavy lifting. Then came the binding agent, condensed tomato soup, sometimes thinned with a bit of water or broth, poured generously over the top to mingle and melt all the ingredients together. Baked until bubbling, tender, and just a little crispy around the edges, it came out of the oven smelling like something far fancier than its ingredient list would suggest. And unlike traditional cabbage rolls, you didn't need a fork and knife or even table manners to dig in. This was weeknight food. Dish it up with a big spoon food. One pan, no frills, just get it on the table before the kids start crying food. But it wasn't just practical, it was comforting. The cabbage mellowed in the heat, the rice soaked up all the savory sweetness of the tomato soup, and the beef gave it heartiness. It tasted like something someone made for you because they cared enough to not waste a thing. Cabbage roll casserole isn't flashy, and it probably wouldn't win any beauty contests, but it tells a story of thrift, of adaptation, of home cooks doing their best with what they had. And in that story, there's a kind of quiet magic. It's a dish that remembers where it came from, even if it doesn't take the long way to get there. How food trends change. What we considered poverty meals now looks a lot like trendy budget cooking. Have you ever eaten one of these? Would you try one? Or do you have a forgotten summer dinner we missed? Sometimes the weirdest old recipes have the most heart and a whole lot more flavor than you'd expect. Like, subscribe and leave a comment about the wildest thing your grandma made you eat in July.